Hello, everyone, and welcome to Global Mental Health Peer Network Speakout podcast, episode 3, on the topic of neurodiversity. My name is Yael Gaya from Israel, and I will be your host today. We are joined also by Julian Collin from Ireland, Carly Montek Cardozo, and Eileen Nuaz, both from the United Kingdom. So let's start with our first speaker, Julian. Hello.
Hi, Yael.
Happy to hear from you and be with you.
Same here. Thank you.
I would like to ask you about this important topic. For the purpose of introduction and definition of neurodiversity, how would you define neurodiversity in simple, accessible terms? And why do you think public understanding of this concept is still so limited?
So neurodiversity is really about a variation in how a person experiences and interacts with the world, and a diversity in the way people process information, learn, and communicate. So it's really like a unique way that a person's brain develops. It's not to be seen as a deficit. It's really about a difference. And it involves a spectrum of diversity, including the likes of ASD or autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, Tourette's, and many more. So there is actually 15 to 20% of the population that have neurodiversity. And what we try to bring awareness of is that it isn't a weakness or something that is preventable or curable. It's just a way that people are unique and different. So I really think that there is an improvement in people's understanding, but it is still very much limited. There's still stigma that has and is still seen in the light in mental health. That in a lot of cultures, people will see it as a disorder that needs to be cured and fixed, that there's a lack of understanding and an awareness around like what it is, what it means. People are seen as different because they're acting outside of social norms and behaviors. There's a kind of a bit of a culture at the moment that it's quite on trend to have a diagnosis, and I'm like, it isn't if anyone knows the procedure of getting assessed, it's not something that you can just pick up willy-nilly. It's also kind of used quite negatively in metaphors for bad behavior, with people really fearing disclosure of being judged and treated differently. And people can often use their own perceptions of what they see neurodiversity to be, or like, the difference in ADHD in women and in men is so different. And a lot of people will say, oh, but you're not bouncing off the walls, you're not really hyper, so you obviously don't have an issue. They don't see it as in women. It can be very much in the thoughts and internally. So that is my part on that.
What?
That was just my thoughts on it. Yes.
Thank you. It was very an important explanation and significant. And I would like to hear more from your lived experience. What are some of the key benefits and challenges associated with neurodivergence, or how do these experiences influence your perspective on how society treats neurodiverse individuals?
So I got diagnosed with ADHD last year in my late 30s, and it was something that it was never on my radar. Something was mentioned in passing, and a lot of only in learning recently, a lot of the traits that I would have found to be just normal everybody does this, I realized that everybody does not do all of the things, and that the things that I might find really useful and helpful might be really challenging for other people. So it's been a lot of aha moments. So
Yes.
I have I'm really creative, and I kind of will really think outside the box, and I might kind of have a different perspective on things, which is really helpful in projects and different things that I'm working with. I have a very, very strong sense of social justice, which is really helps my advocacy work, which I really enjoy. I only just realized recently that ADHD can provide you with a very strong sense of caring, which has really helped me in my professional roles of nursing. I am extraordinarily random, and people don't uh, know what I'll come out with or ideas I have. So it kind of gives a sense of fun around things. And I love systems. I love organizing everybody else's things, but I cannot organize my own life. So, because so then bringing challenges into it, I've got like, I find it very difficult. I thrive on routine, but I also find it very difficult to go stick with routine. I can be really, really forgetful, which causes a lot of frustration with myself and with others in my life. And I feel very deeply, so I'd have an emotional regulation. My focus and concentration is hit and miss, and my energy, I really need to look after how what gives me and takes away my energy, and it's impossible to get up in the morning. So what that impact in my perspective has on society is that at the moment there's what the neurodiverse world will call people who are not neurodiverse is often a term called neurotypicals. So the world is not made for people thinking, feeling, or processing differently at all. So you have to work at a certain time, you have to finish at a certain time, you have to take lunch at a certain time. There's no flexibility. There's the allowances of the likes of hybrid working, or the likes of how people learn and educate in school. If you don't fit into one box, then you're kind of really seen as difficult, or and like kind of to be outside of the norm. It's an issue that needs to be rectified, and it's not a thing that's empowered. It's something that is to be recognized as celebrated. That the work that I might do I might work better in the evening time, or like it's being able to be flexible to people. So I don't think the world is ready for neurodiverse people yet. Yeah.
Wow, this is so interesting. Thank you, Julian.
No
I
problem.
want to ask you a last question about the neurodiversity and mental health can overlap but are not the same, if I understand. So, how would you explain the nuances of this distinction to someone who might mix the two terms?
So so I would have suffered with my mental health for a really long time. And I would have thought that all of my symptoms were actually just mental health. And it ended up that there's a lot of similarities, but also differences as well. So when we're looking at mental illness, mental health, it's like a form of illness or a condition that can affect the way you think and feel, your mood and your behavior. So this can be over a period of time. It can come and go. So it is not static. Like it can be, you can have chronic conditions that will kind of have an impact for a very long period of time. But the difference being that neurodiversity is lifelong. So it's how people experience the world. It can be present from a young age, and it's not a form of illness. So it is something that people are born with. It's not something that would be developed by experience or influenced. And how mental health can get confused into it is there can be very similar symptoms, the likes of concentration or sleep, or emotional regulation, or whatever that it might be. But having the neurodiversity, I'm going to use my example with having ADHD, because my ADHD was unrecognized and I had to mask and kind of pretend to be normal for my entire life. What it did was it caused me to have anxiety and depression. So amongst other things, but there's it is something that can be alongside, but it's not mental health. Like they can kind of have a little relationship, but it doesn't mean if you're neurodiverse you're going to have mental health issues, or if you have mental health issues you're going to be neurodiverse. They're very significantly different.
Yes, I see. It's very clear how you explained it. I understand better now, so thank you.
Good. You're very welcome.
And thank you, Julianne, for all what you have told us. I have learned a lot. And now we will hear from Carly, our second speaker. So, hello, Carly.
Hi.
I'm happy to be with you on this podcast. Thank you. And I want to ask you, when we have spoken before, you raised a point about the interaction between neurodiversity and mental health. Could you elaborate on the ways neurodivergence might contribute to mental health struggles, or vice versa, based on your observation or experiences?
Sure. So I think it's inevitable that neurodivergence and mental health are going to interact in a bidirectional manner. As Julianne clearly explained, the two are separate. One can exist without the other, but they are very much overlapping in many individuals, and one can have an impact on the other. I would maybe pick up on one thing that Julianne said. However, I do think, of course, there are some mental health conditions that can, of course, be lifelong, not just neurodivergence, but there are some mental health conditions or situations that can, of course, be treated. But for me, the difference between the two is in the management and in the triggers. And data from various sources, so in my case being in the UK, I'm thinking of maybe the NHS, which is our National Health Service. Data suggests that people with neurodivergent traits are more likely to have concurrent mental health conditions. But what becomes really tricky is identifying, what that is most likely due to. And I think that varies between individuals. Is it this intrinsic susceptibility? Is it something external? It's very likely both. But I do think one of the major determinants of how much neurodivergence and mental health interact with one another, both from my experience and observations, is our environment. If we find ourselves in situations or environments that are not optimal for us, whether that's with respect to our mental health or neurodivergent traits, then I think the two are much more likely to become entangled. And of course, this impact of environment that we find ourselves in is true for any condition, really, physical or mental. If you're not in the best place or situation for yourself, we're more likely to struggle. And when I talk about environment, I mean both situations and other people. So things like lack of support or understanding, experiencing discrimination or exclusion because of your neurodivergent traits or because of your mental health is, of course, more likely to lead to feelings of isolation and depression. Stress being a big one. Stress can make neurodivergent traits stronger and can make mental health worse. And we can't overlook internal stresses and anxieties that we put on ourselves. And one thing I'm thinking of in particular is masking, whether it's conscious or not. So just to clarify, when I refer to masking, I mean when someone is hiding or filtering their true thoughts or feelings or behaviors or any difficulties they're experiencing in order to fit in with others or what they perceive to be societal expectations. And, of course, everyone does this to some extent, right? We all find ourselves holding back in certain situations. That's normal. It's often advised. But masking in this context is a much more chronic, maybe sometimes maladaptive mechanism for some, and it can be really draining. But it can also be protective at the same time. So just as a side note, sometimes masking is empowering because it helps people stay in control of what others see. And that can, of course, be a positive experience. So I'm not saying masking is all bad all the time, but we can't deny that it can be extremely draining and isolating. And having to do that, hiding, masking neurodivergent traits, draining and can impact on your mental health, because it takes a huge amount of energy. And especially, often you're not aware of that energy until you drop that mask. Sometimes you don't even realize you've been masking until you stop and you get that wave of exhaustion and your shoulders drop and you're like, oh, that was hard work. And also I think with neurodivergence and the interactions with mental health, the one thing we have to all remember, and it's difficult to remember, but the one thing we all have to remember is everyone's going to experience that differently. I think it's crucial to remember and try our best to be respectful of the fact that perspectives and experiences really vary, not just between communities, but individuals. Some will absolutely relate to the experience of neurodivergence having a negative impact on mental health. Others may feel completely neutral about it, not really care, and some may have the complete opposite and have a positive experience and be able to recognize and perhaps cultivate their strengths that their neurodivergent traits give them. And for various reasons, how someone feels about their neurodivergent traits and their mental health may vary day to day, hour to hour, even if our circumstances change. So I think we need to be respectful of the fact that, different views are present, but also the same person will be feeling different things at different times. So this kind of brings you on to, well, how do you even begin to support someone who is neurodivergent or who has a mental health condition if they need support? I think the things that you can do is ask if appropriate. Sometimes it's not always going to be appropriate, but if you're comfortable, they're comfortable, there's nothing wrong with asking sometimes, listening, noticing things, but at the same time, don't make any assumptions. I think this is good advice in general for interacting with people in any context. Never assume what's behind something. But this wish list for how we should behave, what we should keep in mind, is a very big ask for everyone. So I think we need to also learn acceptance on all sides. Accept that someone you may wish to support can have different needs, different days, but also from the other perspective, accept that someone that may wish to support you is just trying their best, and they can only do so much with the information that they have and the capacity that they have. And I think that latter example of acceptance, accepting that person who's trying to support you is trying their best, that can actually be really helpful in itself and take a whole load of tension off of the situation. I'm not saying for 1 minute don't self-advocate, don't recognize when we need to set boundaries and express ourselves, but I think there's a time and place for all reactions. And I think recognizing what's beneficial for all parties moving forward is really key. And so just to summarize that, understanding together as a society how mental health and neurodivergence interact requires that we have and can support this psychologically safe environment in which people have the freedom to choose to share information that may be helpful for them and others, but also to choose not to share if that's the safer option. And I think choice is the key word here for everyone.
Yes. Wow, this is so important. Thank you. I want to ask you another question about terminology. Like the debate over ADHD as a disorder versus neurodivergence. Why do you think language is so important in shaping perceptions of neurodiversity and mental health?
Yeah, language is so important in shaping our perceptions of both neurodivergence and mental health. And this goes for people who have professional experience in the field, as well as those who don't have professional experience. I think everyone is susceptible to being influenced by terminology, unless they're really on the lookout for that bias and the effect that terminology is having on them. So, the anecdote I have that kind of illustrates this, I think I can explain. So I'm the executive editor of a journal called PLOS Mental Health. And so I oversee the journal in terms of strategy, author service, serving our communities. And it's really important to me to strike a balance between being sensitive to all communities, but also not censoring the language and views of others who may have a different perspective, perhaps based on profession or region or a whole host of things. So the precise case I'm talking about, an author was using ADHD as an example of a mental health condition. And this is by no means an isolated case. This is something I see very regularly. But I also know that this is something that many would not agree with, not be comfortable with, for all the reasons we've already discussed. Neurodiversity is separate to mental health. And, of course, many feel that you shouldn't over-medicalize neurodiversity. Flip side of that, of course, is don't trivialize, because this takes away from, struggles that people have, but that's perhaps another discussion. But anyway, the point is there's a very clear view that ADHD is not a mental health condition. So I discussed this with the author, and they raised the point that, well, disorder's in the name. And I mean, you can't argue with that. You can't argue with the implications of the term disorder. So making that universal shift of the view that ADHD is not a mental health condition is tricky if we're focusing on terminology. How can we overcome that, but without trivializing the experience of those who do struggle as a result of our traits? What do? Do we consider maybe replacing the D with a C for condition? But then again, I think condition itself could still imply something that some in the community may not be comfortable with. But, as I've inferred, if you go too far the other way, not only do you trivialize, you're overlooking potential cases, and you run the risk of those who need support not getting the support. So we do have to be mindful of this, and we also have to be really mindful of the discrepancies globally. If you change terminology, say in the UK, the impact of that would be very different to if you change terminology elsewhere. So PLOS Mental Health published a paper, I think in July now, which discusses the reasons for very low detection rates of autism spectrum disorder in Uganda. And this is among mental health professionals. If you shift away from that more clinical handling, you're actually, in my opinion, going to run the risk of making it even harder to detect cases. So you have, what's the answer there? Do you have different terms in different regions? I think that wouldn't be helpful either. That's going to confuse things more. That's not going to help in terms of unifying understanding. And then this brings me to another point about terminology, maybe a contradictory one. Is it redundant? Because if you think about it, one term for how many individuals? What purpose does a name serve? It does help us to identify sources of support if needed, of course. And
Yeah.
some people do take a lot of value and comfort from being able to name something. So in that respect, there's a use. But everyone is so different. I don't know if you could ever comfortably have the same label for any two people. In this respect, it's not like a broken leg, right? So terminology is such a difficult one for me because it's got so much power and so many implications. And some of those implications are essential to progress and understanding and support and acceptance. And some of those add to confusion and bias and isolation. And terminology can both unify, but then in doing so, it can also conceal. So for me, I've spent most of my time on the fence about terminology and how we should handle it. And I'm still very much on the fence, but I would just, come back to saying, again, this terminology is about choice. Everyone should have a choice if they have a label, what that label is. And so again, it's about asking when appropriate, it's about understanding and acceptance on all sides, provided intentions are good. And I can tell you from personal experience, preferences change very regularly. And I don't expect people to keep up with me. I can't keep up with other people. I just expect or hope that others try their best to truly understand. And I think that's really all we can do. It's about personal choice and everyone just trying to understand where everyone else is coming from.
Thank you, Carly. This was very, very interesting and important. So we will go to our third speaker, Eileen. Hello, Eileen.
Hiya.
We are happy to have you with us on the podcast. So I would like to ask you also about this interesting topic of neurodiversity. So how do you think mental health challenges can impose difficulties in finding appropriate treatment for neurodivergent individuals? Maybe can you share more about your personal experience with this and how it shaped your view on treatment systems?
Yeah, so I think that I most profoundly experienced this when I was about 14, and I was in a psychiatric hospital. And I was initially admitted for anorexia, but it soon became clear that there were some other issues under the surface. So that in itself complicated things, but then the added fact of being diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder when I was 15 made the treatment options available far more difficult. And I think that the treatment pathways that are currently available in the UK are incredibly linear and mutually exclusive. So then when the issue of comorbidity arises, the lines between illness become blurred and suddenly don't fit so nicely into neat categories, although they probably never fit in the first place. And there are a lot of confounding symptoms between various different disorders and autism. And then for me, my own personal experience with anorexia, the main kind of symptom overlap was a strong dislike for foods of particular texture. And this was particularly problematic in this situation because my allowance to visit home was dictated by whether or not I ate all my food. And it just didn't seem that possible to the staff that I could be refusing food for another reason and not as a result of the anorexia. But aside from just the sort of practical challenges in treatment, being misunderstood in this way often left me feeling quite frustrated and isolated. And I feel that that's probably quite a shared experience with neurodiverse individuals that also suffer from mental health problems. And particularly just because I felt that my needs and my voice wasn't being acknowledged and heard through the treatment process, which I think very much reinforced the sense of invisibility that many neurodivergent individuals experience in the systems. And then, unfortunately, when I did get the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, the tailoring of my treatment was still very much unsuitable. And an example was my therapist attended to conduct a session entirely non-verbally, using animal stickers and coloring pens to describe about how I felt. And I was 16 years old. So
Wow.
clearly very inappropriate to be doing that. So that for me really highlighted the need for a holistic and integrative treatment for disorders that can commonly coincide. And then also that highlights the need for some research and also then more focused treatment for people that are older, because I think a lot of people associate the symptoms and issues with autism spectrum disorder, particularly with being quite young. But of course, it's something that can affect you your whole life. And, you wouldn't give that sort of therapeutic treatment to someone that was over 18. So why would you give it to a 16-year-old?
This is a really significant point of view. Thank you for sharing your experience. I'm curious to hear, what do you think needs to change in mental health care to ensure it better supports the unique needs of neurodiverse individuals? Are there any specific examples you can point to of what works or doesn't work?
So I think the experiences that I've just highlighted show a systemic issue in the mental healthcare system, particularly with a tendency to focus on single diagnosis treatment approaches, which then often overlook the complex needs of individuals that have comorbidities. And I think that this rigid system then can lead to a misinterpretation of symptoms and ultimately ineffective care. So, for example, treating someone with both autism and anxiety as though these conditions exist in isolation can often result in the misinterpretation of symptoms, particularly as anxiety-related behaviours might be dismissed as inherent traits of autism, and thus leading to treatments that fail to address the root cause. But I also think that there needs to be a greater understanding on how individuals at various points on the spectrum may have different needs. And specifically, autism, but I think also all neurodiverse conditions exist on a spectrum to some extent. And the needs of an individual will vary not just from person to person, but also over time. So, for instance, for me personally, while sensory overload was a significant challenge for me as a child, I learned strategies to manage it as an adult. And for me, this would highlight the need for an adaptable care plan that would evolve with the individual, and not just with diagnoses. Um, so then I feel as well that there's a need for a better understanding of the gender differences in neurodiverse conditions, which may in turn help inform approaches to treatment. And I think that this is highlighted in the fact that the split of gender in neurodiversity research is widely disproportionate to men. And this disproportionate focus on men in neurodiversity has led to gaps in understanding how conditions can manifest differently in women and non-binary individuals. So, for example, women are often underdiagnosed because their symptoms can be more internalized, which means that their needs may go unrecognized in standard treatment models. And so to address these issues, I think that mental health services should prioritize co-designed care pathways involving individuals with lived experience at every age, every stage of the service development. And additionally, mandatory training for professionals should include recognizing gender differences in neurodiverse conditions, understanding comorbidities, and tailoring interventions to individual needs. So, for instance, a positive example I've seen in therapy is where there is an incorporation of sensory tools to manage kind of emotional overload, which can often be a game changer for neurodiverse individuals. But conversely, more kind of blanket treatments like rigid CBT protocols will often fail because they don't account for the unique way in which neurodiverse people process emotions and experiences.
Yes.
So, sorry. And so ultimately, I think that mental health must embrace flexibility, inclusivity, and a commitment to ongoing learning. And so by doing so, we can create systems that truly support the diverse needs of neurodiverse individuals, allowing them to thrive at every stage of life.
Wow. I will ask you a last question. In your experience, do you think society tends to focus too much on the challenges of neurodivergence rather than the strength? And how can this be reframed?
So I think there is a massive focus on the challenges of neurodiversity, and society often defines neurodivergence through the lens of its challenges. And while these are real, this narrow perspective overlooks the immense potential and unique strengths of these people that fall into the neurodiverse category. And the emphasis on deficits perpetuates the stereotypes that are commonplace already, shaping a society where neurodiverse individuals are seen as less capable. And so not only does this affect their self-esteem, especially for those perhaps newly diagnosed, but also deprives society of the diverse perspectives and problem-solving approaches neurodivergent people can bring. And so I understand to an extent where this sort of focus on the difficulties has come from, but I also feel but because I myself could only focus on the difficulties for a very long time, it's only more recently that I've been able to sort of appreciate the strengths that has actually given me. And so a reframing is definitely necessary. So, for example, for me, I saw my sort of enhanced emotional sensitivity as a weakness, especially when it left me quite vulnerable in my relationships. But over time, I've come to view this as actually a profound strength, as it enables me to connect deeply with others, empathize with their struggles, and build meaningful relationships. And to me, I think that it's a gift that enriches my life and the lives of those around me. And I think there also needs to be a shift in the view that neurodiverse people are less able than neurotypicals, but rather they are just less able to flourish in a society built for neurotypicals. So to truly shift this narrative, we must create a space that allows neurodivergent individuals to thrive. So this means fostering inclusive environments, improving education about neurodiversity, and adapting workplaces and social systems to accommodate diverse needs. And so by doing so, we can actually highlight the strengths that might otherwise remain untapped. But more fundamentally, there needs to be a shift from this narrative. So neurodiverse individuals will often excel in areas requiring creativity, innovation, or unique problem-solving skills. And so a heightened focus, sorry. And so as an example, a heightened focus and attention to detail can often be invaluable in professions that perhaps neurotypicals may struggle with. So recognizing and cultivating these strengths benefits not only the neurodiverse individual, but also society more generally. And so reframing neurodivergence isn't just about reducing the stigma, it's about revealing potential that may otherwise be hidden. And so by recognizing the strengths and unique contributions of neurodivergent individuals, we can pave the way to a more inclusive and innovative society.
Wow, thank you for sharing your experience. It seems so authentic and rich.
Thank you.
Yes, it was very touching to hear you.
Thank you.
So this was our podcast of neurodiversity, and I thank all our speakers today, and I hope that we have given you, our listeners, a deeper understanding and perspective on neurodiversity and what this means as people with lived experience and experts alike. And we want to have you with us again on our next podcast.